Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Furidashi podcast, where we cast pods about games and designing games and the design. I'm kind of rambling. I'm here. I'm Nicholas, and I am here with our great friend Lauren. Lauren, say hi to the beautiful people.
Hi to the beautiful people. I also love casting pods to all of you everywhere. And what's really great about AAA is the word cast and the word pod is in my lexicon at work. So that's always been really, really fun.
Yeah. So speaking of designing for a AAA studio, although, I mean, Lauren's situation is sort of like weirdly situated between like AAA and whatever the tier below that is. I don't even, AA?
Yeah.
2A and a half.
No, I absolutely would say that we're absolutely in the AAA space. When you have the mudget, when you have the money / budget, also known as mudget. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 11th season 4 episode of the Furidashi podcast. I am your host, Lauren Ash, here with Nicholas. And as you can see, we have been having a lovely brainstorm time. And so our brains are just in the brainstorming mentality. We are just not 100% in the professional mood. We are in that creative brainstorming space.
Yeah, it's definitely a severe weather situation in the collective brain space of Lauren and Nicholas.
It is.
Yeah, and the reason why we've been in the stormy brain is because one of the things that we wanted to talk about, especially for people who are like getting into game design or sort of in their early years of maybe working for a studio or about contemplating their own work, is to sort of the contrast between designing for like established audiences in an established space versus designing for, I guess you could say, an audience that has yet to be tapped into, and that in many ways the mindset that you have to adopt for these two particular situations is very different. And while the working like within a studio context for a AAA studio or even for like a large indie studio, like people pretty much understand how that's supposed to work. There are plenty of examples that you can look to. There are courses that you can take online for all of that stuff. But when it comes to the space where like you want to maybe venture out on your own and you want to do something novel or do something that just kind of doesn't really fit within that sort of like established order, there isn't a lot out there that helps you understand like how to approach that from a design perspective. I mean, there's a lot of information that you can find with regards to sort of like, oh, how to market your game, or like how to like do advertising, how to like get a publishing deal, things like that. Like the nuts and bolts stuff that you can find, but the kind of more philosophical, or you could say like creative / design oriented kinds of things, not as readily available. So that's one of the things that we kind of want to, I don't think Lauren and I have hard and fast ideas about like what that mindset looks like, but we are going to talk through it today to see what kinds of conclusions that we can come to, and maybe some of that will be of use to you all out there.
Yeah. So this is going to be a really nice episode because I think what we'll do is kind of talk about what does it mean to have an established kind of audience versus what does it mean to have, I don't want to say an unestablished audience, but those players out there, you're kind of like asking yourselves, I'm not sure if people will enjoy this game. And I think what's really great about that for me is when I was starting in my design kind of field, you go into wanting to make something new and something novel. You're making new mechanics and new ideas and new principles, and you kind of have to go and then play test it like we talked about in the last episode and try to figure out if the playtesting mechanics are doing the intended design and expected player behaviors. And what we're finding, right, over and over again is that expected player behavior now in the industry is very, very well known. And
Yeah.
so my examples will actually be focused on more of the biz dev side. So that will be things like untapped markets, finding your market, but also will be in mobile gaming because I've been playing a lot of gotcha games. And so I'm actually going to be doing that to kind of really understand and segue like an established, quite frankly, unfun game so that we can all really kind of recognize the unfunness of some mechanics and tedium to kind of separate them, which is why I call it a biz dev space, because those types of games are highly successful
Yeah, they make
in
a lot of
making
money.
money.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they make a lot of money. And if, once again, reflecting back on our last previous episode, success is not monetary. But when it comes to established markets and kind of creating something that you know the expected player behavior will, once again, make you money and make Big Daddy proud, then I think that we look at those things and go, okay, that's why you have a lot of established right types of games.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to be like, that's kind of a known space. And so I'm super excited with Nicholas to kind of dive into the unknown space so he can kind of kick us off there. So we can instead, once we get out of that business space, then both of us can kind of be like, okay, here's what established means, here's what unestablished means, and just focus on how to kind of brainstorm and think about that philosophically as a designer when you are maybe wanting to make something that is, you could say, highly marketable for a mass market audience, but is also incredibly novel and unique.
Yeah, because the two things are not necessarily opposed to each other. Like, you can be innovative and different and unusual, and you can make a game that has mass market success. And I point this out because the sort of the genesis for this conversation was, so I was just, I don't even know why I was browsing through this. I think it was the one on IGN, like the 100 greatest games of all time. And I was just looking at it and going through it, and I was like, okay, yeah, most of these are sort of obvious. And then I got through to the end of it. Number one, by the way, was Breath of the Wild, which, by the way, is a really fantastic game. I can understand why they think it is the greatest game of all time. I don't really have any quibbles with that, so much as there was one game that wasn't anywhere on the list, and I was really curious as to why, and that is Katamari Damacy. Um, which is a game that, like, people do actively recognize as a really amazing, innovative game. Like, people are aware of its existence. The game made a buttload of money. It was really successful. It's had several ports. Like, it was essentially remastered for the Nintendo Switch. So, by all of the metrics, Katamari was a success. But then it left me with this question of like, okay, but why isn't it despite being extremely innovative and literally even to this day, kind of there isn't another game like it other than the sequel that was made for that game. um, why is it that it's not recognized within this sort of like canon of games? And I had this thought, and maybe Lauren, you disagree, that I don't actually like I get this sense that people think that it was successful because it was quirky, because it was weird, because it was sort of perceived as bizarre, and that bizarreness is kind of a one-off. That's not something that you can replicate necessarily. It's not something that you can latch onto as sort of like starting a trend. Like, it was a one-hit wonder in a sense. But I'm like, I don't actually think that that's correct. And I think it's partially because I have yet to see, and if anyone out there knows of something that has actually taken a deep dive into this, I would perfectly happy to be corrected. But I don't think anyone's really sort of dove into sort of like the way in which its very novel mechanics also, in a certain way, cultivated an audience that, or not even really cultivated, in many ways created an audience for that kind of game that like no one else was really paying attention to in an active way. And there's a history of games that do this, like Angry Birds. So to go to the mobile space, Angry Birds is a really good example of a game that did this. um, but again, I think games like that people tend to write off as sort of like existing in their own little world. But the thing is, so like if you look at the individual mechanics of Katamari, the mechanics are pretty straightforward. The narrative's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Um, and it's funny because the king of the cosmos is this bizarre weirdo, and he gives you all sorts of strange tasks, but also kind of hates his own son at the same time. It's very fun. But one of the things that distinguishes Katamari from a lot of other games is that the appeal of its mechanics are immediately apparent. Like the second you go into the game, you start rolling your little ball around, you roll it over a cat, the cat goes meow when that happens. Like there is an
Yeah.
immediate sense of like, oh, okay, I understand why this is fun. Whereas when it comes to established games and established genres, I feel that sometimes studios rely on sort of like built up goodwill so as to not necessarily have to design a game where that appeal is sort of like right in the player's face from the get-go. And I think this is what leads to a lot of conversations where people will say things like, oh, well, you have to play this game for at least 20 hours or 50 hours or 100 hours to really get into it and understand why it's a great game. But if you think about it, that's kind of a ridiculous ask for a player who is not already invested in that world and in that sort of that genre or that type of game. And that when you're in the sort of the much more difficult and sort of uncertain territory of having to create a game whose appeal you don't necessarily know if it's going to land, that when you're in that mindset, you really sort of have to think about like how your mechanics and sort of like the feel of them are then going to draw the player in. A Disco Elysium is another good example of this, where it's like because it foregrounds like a lot of the math and turns that into sort of like an apparent function of how the game exists for the player in the user experience. Like there's a clear hook there, and there's a clear sense of like what kind of person, or not necessarily what kind of person that it would appeal to, but that it is making an effort to sort of like reach out to the player and say, I'm going to draw you in, rather than like creating a game that has players who are already like frothing at the mouth for it. And it's like, here you go, here's the thing you wanted.
Yeah. And I love the kind of like evolution of looking at Katamari as well, because I think that as you're listening to kind of Nicholas talk about the kind of appeal and drawing you in versus, right, placing you in an experience that you already kind of understand how it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
I think that what's frustrating as a developer and as a player is being placed in an experience where you have an expectation of how it works, and then things that prevent you from getting to that experience as quick as possible now become hurdles or obstacles.
Yeah.
And we see this all the time in particularly really large franchises like Ubisoft, or that is the franchise now. Or
Ubisoft, the company, is now a franchise.
or also right in battle royale games. Like everyone
Yeah.
hates logging into a multiplayer game, and now you're like, I just want to shoot mechanics with my friends. I'll figure it out on the way. You won't. And I hate having to do the first time user experience. Like, why do I keep getting thrown into this tutorial, right? Like, you just want
Yeah.
to play or match with your friends.
Yeah.
So I think what's really great about understanding this, right, is that you as a player have an expectation of how a battle royale is going to function. You as a player also have an expectation when you pick up Far Cry or Assassin's Creed or the next Watch Dogs game. You have an expectation of how those are going to happen. And so while this episode isn't going to talk about how do you innovate in an existing space, this episode is focusing on how do you innovate not having any of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That I think that focusing on Katamari is really exciting to me, because I think it didn't make that list because while Katamari Damacy was really fun to play and did draw you in and immediately had that kind of sticking factor, it was sticky, but then just kind of like the ball over time, things didn't stick as well. And so I think that it was why a lot of people talk about it as a one-hit wonder is that people felt like there was only so much you can do. And now you can't see me because we don't record videos for this, but I'm putting that in heavy scare quotes. And I hope that that came across in the audio as well. There's only so much you can do, Nicholas, with rolling a ball around the ground, right?
Yeah.
And picking up everything in your way to complete the different levels and to continue that thin thread of narrative.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that using that as an example, right, is interesting because it was still a small subset of players and a small subset of people. Versus when we look at Breath of the Wild, right, like that I think hit an intonation of innovation, right, in an existing franchise. And that was established. Everybody was already kind of hungry for it. And then drew in new players who were like, well,
Yeah.
what is this? Because this is not what I had expected, right?
Yeah, I mean, this gets us into somewhat difficult territory with regards to like one of because there are a lot of moving parts, especially when you're talking about a really really big budget game like Breath of the Wild. Like in many ways, it's not even a fair comparison. Like, I mean, they came out on completely different systems. Um, Katamari came out at a time when like the sort of the mass market player base for video games was like orders of magnitude smaller. And so, but I mean, I think you're right. Part of the problem is though that like when you're talking about okay, this brings me back to sort of the mindset issue is that
Yeah.
when Nintendo in particular designs a game, and I know this because you know, I've read biographies from some of their like earliest like producers and studio heads, is that they very much saw games initially as kind of an outgrowth of toys. And this is important for Nintendo as a company because that was one of the things that they were doing predominantly in the 60s and 70s is that they were essentially making toy like game things, if you will. And that design ethos persisted in a lot of, you know, even the consoles that they developed, like the Wii itself and its controller and its like basic controller setup is designed around this ethos of sort of like the game console as toy. um I think one of the reasons why Breath of the Wild and also its follow-up Tears of the Kingdom had such broad success is that Nintendo finally found a way to marry like the toy logic of game design to sort of like the classic sense of a game as sort of like not necessarily a narrative experience, but sort of a clear experience with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it is narrative like in that sense. And you can see this especially in Tears of the Kingdom, where a great deal of the appeal of that game is based in sort of like all of the stuff that you can make using kind of like these little component pieces that the game hands you. And so there's that toy like quality to it, but it exists within the context of kind of the narrative structure of a Zelda game rather than just being like a purely sandbox experience, because that's not actually what Tears of the Kingdom is. And so then in many ways, it's drawing from part of the design ethos that you see in a game like Katamari, where it's taking something that is relatively novel, but then sort of like importing it back into that sort of mainstream design space. And so that's why, in many ways, Breath of the Wild is a good example of like why this is not a strict dichotomy. But then when it comes to designing the games that are on that far end of the spectrum, so like we've seen where like the marriage of the two lives in this AAA space. But when it comes to sort of like games where you want to create a user experience that is equally valid to other user experiences. And to go back to something that you said, Lauren, about how Katamari gets that there's not really much else you can do with a game like Katamari. I think in many ways that kind of like draws people into a discursive space where they're sort of not really addressing the assumption that like certain game experiences are considered to be more valid and more important than other game experiences.
Oh, and I don't think that's what I was trying to say. Like I actually
No, I don't
really
think
liked
that's
your
what
Breath
you
of
were
the
trying to say.
Wild.
I think that's sort of
Yeah.
yeah.
No, and I think that like let's not talk about the validity here because we are going to go into our brainstorming section in a couple minutes here for everyone where we're going to just kind of back and forth it. I think that for me like Breath of the Wild is interesting because it was an innovating in what you could be defined right as an established space. Like they kind of
Yeah.
knew their market
Yeah.
and they did really rigorous testing to see if players would engage more as what they kept kind of saying is return to the original Zelda, like return to more of an open world kind of sandbox toy like experience. And I think what's been really fascinating here is that in doing so, they actually no longer had what you could say is an established market, right? So
Yeah.
when it comes to designing for a known audience, the ideological principle I have is very much like, I know what a Naughty Dog game is like. I know what an Uncharted is going to feel like. I know what the level design is going to be. I know what the narrative needs to be. I know there needs to be cutscenes at the end of every level and the beginning of every level, and then maybe in the middle of the level, because now it's Uncharted 4, and there we have a lot more budget and we're trying to tell a much more interesting story. But
Yeah.
every level is a level, right? You've got what used to be called, right, corridors and arenas, right?
Yeah.
Every shooter was a corridor. You're going to go through some things. You get to your arena, boss battle, right? Like this is very established principles, right? And then you go into a larger group and there's an established way of doing things. Like we're all going to be collectively marching forward, creating these expectations for ourselves. And then, especially in a much more kind of corporate environment or owned by a huge corporate entity, it very much becomes like a checklist design where it's like, okay, you said you were going to build 6 levels. We need to build 6 levels. Each level is going to end with a boss fight. There's going to be 3 cutscenes per level. And if there's 6 levels, that means there's going to be 18 cutscenes. Like it just kind of becomes tyranny of math. And then you end up becoming on the hook to do those things, even if it doesn't make your game experience good. And
Yeah.
this isn't new. Okay, this has happened since the 1990s, probably 1980s, right? Like this is a way of producing and creating a production line for games,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to the design ideology of that, you cannot, as a designer, think, I just am going to make 18 cutscenes, 6 levels, 3 cutscenes per level, 6 boss battles because every level ends in a boss. But like that's not creative, right?
No.
So this is about coming into creativity, right?
Yeah.
And recognizing like, how do we go from a way where there's an established principle, an established way of doing things, into thinking about the ways in which we aren't reinventing the wheel? Because I
Yeah.
think that in some cases, reinventing the wheel is like creating a whole new, maybe say, way of collecting items in the world. When quite
Yeah.
frankly, like just let players pick up an item and add it to their inventory. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's very simple.
Yeah,
Okay.
you don't need to invent an entirely new mechanic for absolutely everything.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. You don't need to
exactly.
invent a new mechanic, right? But when you are trying to invent a new mechanic, right, and you have an unestablished audience, right, or an untapped market, I think it's been really interesting to kind of see, right, how do we get into that? How do we get in and design into that headspace?
So I think there are two ways that we could look at this. I want to posit a couple of theses. Thesis number one is that when it comes to sort of like getting back into a creative space and sort of reintegrating novel ideas, maybe even into established forms, that you have to sort of like in many ways go to a point where like game design and UX design are synonymous with one another. And so what I mean is that you don't necessarily think about them as like siloed, compartmentalized like parts of a design studio, but rather like when you were designing a gameplay experience, you are fundamentally thinking about it in terms of like, okay, what am I doing to the player? Like what kinds of feelings am I cultivating in them? Do I want them to have those feelings? And you're thinking much more conscientiously about, strangely, everything gets up in the air because your focus is on sort of like what state or what condition do you want the player to be in. And so then that becomes your priority. And so you can mess with different kinds of mechanics and different ways of approaching it precisely because you're not married to established principles. What you are actually married to is this idea that, like, I want what the player experiences to look like X, Y, and Z. How do I accomplish that? And then sort of work backwards from that rather than sort of like beginning with sort of like the mechanics that you have established and that you have set and then working from that to the player experience. So in many ways, it's sort of a question of direction. Are you working from your design principles towards the player experience, or are you working from the player experience towards your design principles? That's thesis number one. Thesis number two is one in which, like, you can also think of creativity as not necessarily deviating away from established principles, but in many ways integrating established things that people haven't thought of as going together before. And so we already talked about Breath of the Wild and how Breath of the Wild did this like very, very well. The biggest game of 2024, well, 2023 into 2024, like Baldur's Gate 3, is another example of a game that took two styles of gameplay, the sort of the more like narrative focused, like visual novel-ish Disco Elysium type style of gameplay, and married that with like tactical style gameplay, and it did it very well. Like it took these two things that historically were thought of as completely distinct from one another and found a way to marry them together. And it is in that marriage where a lot of novel things were discovered as a result. But that's an example of like you're taking two established like design principles and philosophies, but then using the way in which they kind of contradict and interact with each other as a productive creative space. So those are my two theses. Like one, the mashup principle. So that was thesis number two. And then the other one is like, which direction are you thinking of the flow from design to player experience? So which one of those do you want to tackle, or neither, or, whatever?
No, I actually no, I think I mean like it's not just so much like those are two different ways of like thinking. I think what's really interesting here is that as a designer, right? I was looking at like I think it's a bit contrary to say that you have a direction of design principles that guide you towards the player experiences, but then you're saying the player experience is then looping back in to create those design principles. And so I think that's what I was kind of ended up going into, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that player advocacy and kind of really thinking about it from the player's perspective is almost becoming a lost art in an established market space, where there are constantly kind of like these political battles of like, well, I think the player is going to want this, or I think the player is going to want that. And without like a really good understanding of like who your player type is and what they're really looking for out of the experience, you're not really going to get that level of detail or depth or like emotional connection like you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm super curious, like, do you feel that the player experience and through just kind of experimentation is what creates those design principles? Or are you thinking that you have design principles and then those leads you to a player experience, or like a mix of both, right?
I
Like
would
this
say
isn't an either or, but
well, I would say more. It isn't an either or, but more of the first than the second. And the reason why, so I'm going to use an
and
example.
more of the first is
Yeah,
going to be the player experience helps you create the design principles, just for
exact,
everybody to be here. Okay.
exactly. So it's the idea that instead of like working from a basic idea of what you want your mechanics to be, and then looking at like how players react and sort of like tweaking them as a result. What I'm saying is what you want your basic mechanics to be is actually an open question. And what guides that question, because then you're in a space of like, okay, well, now what the hell am I going to do? Your guidance for that question then becomes like, okay, well, actually I'm going to begin from the in many ways kind of the end point, if you will. It's like I want the player to end up here, and once I get a firm sense of what here is, and that could be like a feeling, it could be a narrative arc, it could be like the way in which like they get like physically involved in like the manipulation of a controller or whatever. Like once you've determined what that is and you have maybe not a hard conclusion, but definitely a relatively firm one, you then go back to your game mechanics and your design principles, and you figure out what they would have to look like in order to get to that endpoint. So that's what I mean by there's a question. And
Yeah, I like that. I know I'm not trying to cut you off here, but I actually really like that because I think that as I've developed games and I've developed these like guidelines and principles for my team, what I've really realized that kind of sticks and works is that I'm like, this is the type of emotional tone or emotional quality that I want to hit.
yeah,
So, in order to get there, this is the guideline that is going to achieve that, right? That I think. Now, let's
yeah,
test that theory. And if my guideline ends up resulting, right, in a totally different experience or emotional like outlook, right? Then I think we know that we have, I don't want to say failed, but we know that it didn't work. So something has to change, right? Either it didn't get the emotion I wanted, but the players enjoyed it, or the players didn't enjoy it, but it got the emotion I wanted. Well, now, right, we have to choose, right? Are we going to err on the side of, okay, players really didn't enjoy the moment, so I need to change the moment,
Yeah.
right? Or how do I change my principle, right, to better reflect this new player experience? Maybe the principle was right and then our execution of it was, but then it didn't land on my target, but the player said, oh, this mechanic or this feature or this narrative moment all really still were really fun because of this other reason. And so now I go, okay, so somehow we got to a good experience, but now it wasn't hitting, you could say, my direction or like my design intent.
Yeah. And I actually have a concrete example of how this can work from my own experience. So recently I started working on a new card game that is really kind of it's very skeletal at the moment. I'm still trying to work out like what the mechanics are going to be. And so I initially, when I first started off, I was like, because I really like creating single player card games for some reason. This is a thing I enjoy because I like creating an experience that is relatively, I guess you could say, insular, and where it's very much about crafting the situation for like a single person in a particular moment at a particular time. I enjoy that. But then as I was thinking through like, so like the sort of the guiding principle that I had for this is that I want there to be sort of like three buckets in which things that happen in the game fall into. Bucket number one are things that sort of affect the player themselves and are guided by what they do. Bucket number two was things that sort of happen to the player and which are largely beyond their control. Bucket three is then a mix of the two. So, like, you can have fully intrinsic, fully extrinsic, and then things that are a mix of the two. And originally, when I conceptualized this game, I wanted to create something like I had created before with Snow, which is this sort of like single player experience. And so then, but then I started to realize, no, actually, okay, going back to that conception of what I wanted the player experience to be, like, I want them to, A, feel like sometimes they're in control, sometimes they're completely out of control, and sometimes I want them to feel like they're both in and out of control of what's going on. And from that perspective, what I realized is that it was actually much better to make this a competitive two-player experience, because then each player could represent for the other the thing that is completely beyond their control. And the sort of the the way I've been thinking about this game is that I want it to be like a kind of a competitive deck building exercise, where like one player takes on the role of trying to sort of put together the narrative of a relatively good life, but then the other player is trying to put together the narrative of a relatively shitty life. And so then like one player is trying to like play cards into sort of this deck building experience that are, positive experiences, whereas the other player is trying to play things into the deck that are negative
Yeah. And I
experiences.
actually really love that as well. Like I love the idea of it's almost like the black and white like video game, like a good god versus a bad
Yeah,
god. And
exactly.
then
Yeah.
if
I
you
love
choose
that
like
game, by the way.
and I love that game. So I really love this idea of like a board game, card game where you're like it's almost like you're playing with a person's life versus like I guess people's, right? Anyway,
Yeah,
I just wanted to like shout that out there because I think it's a really interesting thing that it sounds like is coming from your concrete like okay, I had to use the player experience to kind of
exactly. That's
dictate.
that's that's the point that I was trying to make, is that literally I completely changed the way the game works so that it could map better onto the player experience. And that's what I mean by working from the player experience first. I had these three specific things that I wanted the player to get out of like playing the game, and by using that as like a very clear focus and a set of like guiding principles, I could then go back and like take a very hard look at the mechanics that I was already starting to build and work on and be like, no, I have to do this in a fundamentally different way. And what I realized, and then so like I completely changed things up as a result, and it created a much more novel, at least for me, design experience, because like I then wasn't making the kind of game that I have made before. I was now making a game that I haven't, the kind of game I haven't made before. And so it was both novel in terms of like what I'm then going to be offering the player, but it was also novel for me as the designer, because now
Yeah.
I'm working in a space where I felt less comfortable, but at the same time more invigorated and more, I guess you could just say, passionate about what I was doing. Because for me, it is very important when I design things that it's doing something that sort of like interests and intrigues me. If I'm doing something by rote or something that I already understand very well, it's very hard for me to like consistently work on it. And so like
Yeah. And
it works both ways.
it works both ways. I think what's really, really great here is that I think that in both cases, when you talk about coming from the player experience, I don't really see them as two theses. Like I actually see them all as one kind of big philosophy or ideology that we're trying to get at here, which is how to think about like getting into that right headspace.
Yeah.
And so I think that when you're designing for what you could consider like a new audience, or maybe even an audience that you think really likes these types of games, it's like you have to kind of look at the novelty aspect. I think novelty is something that we've kept saying on this. And so I'm just going to really head in on
Just get it
that.
out of there.
Yeah. No, is that when like just right into it, just dive right into novelty, because when it comes to novelty, that is the first kind of thing that players think about us when they think about a game. I think in the first 8 minutes, right, a player is going to understand, am I invested in what you're doing? Am I excited to know more? And am I curious about what comes next? I think
Yeah.
if you don't get those three things, right, you're going to miss the mark. And
Yeah.
so a lot of the times, the reason why narrative, I think, is so important, especially in systemic games, is that you have to have something that can help answer those three questions. And those questions really are a why, right? But they're
Yeah.
also, what about your game is going to make me sit here for more than 8 minutes, or say, and I say 8 minutes because quite frankly, like I think that there's always like you've played 1 hour of this game on Steam, right? So it's what's going to make me play an hour really.
Yeah.
But I think that when we look at first impressions in psychology, and we look at first impressions in, say, businessing, marketing, right? All ads have to be 12 seconds now because of TikTok, or 15, I guess. But like all of that, right? Roping out. Actually, most ads on YouTube are 5 seconds, by the way.
Yeah.
Crazy. But that's what I'm saying. 5 seconds, 8 minutes, 1 hour, regardless of the time, it's novelty. How are you going to get me invested? What about your experience feels new and exciting that I want to try it out? And so much so that I have to stop playing. So I'm curious about what happens next. And I think that when I say narrative, I'm not necessarily talking about the story or the plot or the characters. What I'm really talking about is the experience, the holistic, total whole, right?
Yeah.
I got into this game and I see this establishing shot of a wasteland. And as the camera pans further and further down, I see a rat scuttling around. Oh my God, I'm the rat.
Yeah.
Now, right, you're suddenly like, holy shit, what happens next? What do I know? And now you have projected onto that experience of, I know what it's like to be a rat. Now, you don't actually know, okay? It's
Yeah.
like Remy in Paris, but you know it's a wasteland. You know there's a rat, and you know you're playing as it. So now you go, holy shit, I'm curious. What happens when I become this rat? Okay, can I jump? Why can't I jump? What's going on? Oh, my leg is damaged. Okay, so you have to hook, right? Now this is more of maybe a single player experience, but hey, there's 4 players in this game now, and you're all rats. Well, my point is, as I design this rat wasteland game in front of you guys on the spot, is to understand that there is, without any player experience, right? I think it's that second principle Nicholas is talking about, the contrarian, right? The two opposing systems together. You can
Yeah.
do just from a very quick 2 opposing narrative ideals together. I'm playing a really cool wasteland. I see my establishing shot. In my
Yeah.
head, I was imagining the camera being at like a person's angle, right? You see rats scuttling around, right? So you're like, oh, this is just kind of cool. And then suddenly you become rat, right?
Yeah.
I think I stole this directly from the Stray intro, which is where you play the cat.
Yeah.
But honestly, right, when they marketed it now, right, everyone knows you play the cat.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is more, if you could say, the trailer principle of
Yeah.
design.
So like when
right?
it
But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
definitely really good, right? It's
I think
definitely one way to get into the headspace.
yeah, I think I think I actually have an example of something that you're trying to get at, which is this idea that it's perfectly fine to antagonize existing design principles. And that maybe you should do that. And that through that antagonism, through sort of like both subverting the expectation, oftentimes a good way to get to subverting the expectations of the player is to actually subvert your own expectations as a designer, first and foremost. And I thought this especially when I was playing the two Hellblade games recently, because it's sort of, in many ways, it markets itself as a kind of story driven classic hack and slash game. Like it very much has that sort of like third person melee combat focus that is recognizable from many, 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 many games going back many, many years, many generations of consoles. But when you get into the game, one of the things that you realize is that combat is actually much slower and much more deliberate. Whereas, sort of like the general trend over the years has been towards like faster combos, push more buttons, do more things, more, 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 more. Whereas that game is like, wait a minute, what if we took that same well established combat design, but we slowed it way down to such an extent where now you're not thinking about combat in sort of button mashing terms, but you're thinking about it tactically. Like I need like at each moment I need to sort of read legibly what's happening in the game and respond appropriately, because if I don't, I take so much damage that I'm screwed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it like increases the threat of enemies while at the same time slowing down combat. And that's taking an established like gameplay experience, tweaking it in a fundamental way by literally going directly against what the sort of the established trend for that particular style of gameplay is. And so it's perfectly valid to then look at, say, an arena shooter, or just like any of these like, or like an Apex Legends, any of these like very, very popular common games now. And it's like, what would a Call of Duty game even look like if you slowed combat way down? If it wasn't about twitch mechanics, if it, first of all, you'd probably alienate most of your player base. But it is actually an interesting design exercise to think about what would Call of Duty look like if it were more tactically focused in terms of combat rather than just like, 360 headshot no scope. And I don't actually know what that game is. Maybe that game is Splinter Cell, because Splinter Cell is a little bit more tactically oriented and is in many ways a lot harder as a result.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is like, I think interestingly enough, when we look at that kind of design principle, immediately I was thinking of like Tarkov
Yeah.
or Ghost Recon,
Yeah.
right? And I think that a tactical shooter, right, is now something where you are getting into, right, something that is more tactical. There isn't a lot of twitch mechanics, and you're thinking about Call of Duty from its twitch mechanic standpoint, but what about a Call of Duty like narrative on a tactical shooter, right?
Yeah.
Would it even, I don't want to say make sense, but like would it even make sense, right? And I think that this is a great way to get into that headspace, right? This is what this brainstorm and this creativity is about. Because so much of our lives we kind of like are playing games, we understand we want to make games, or we are making games, right? Because that's what Nicholas and I are doing. But as we like, when I looked at this originally, a lot of the time that my brain was getting really creative was I was thinking about the types of mechanics I didn't realize I was designing when I first started in game design and doing like 2D Unity games. Or, hey, I just want to do a game that's a visual novel. But instead of just doing a visual novel, I want to have some sort of like narrative progression system where only by engaging with the characters can you actually level up your own skills by choosing the right dialogue options, right? But you can't level up other skills with other characters if you choose the right dialogue option for someone they are opposed to.
Yeah.
So that means that you can only, right, invest and progress in certain characters and storylines each time. And so you need to replay the game. Like this is just something that I've been wanting to do forever. And I'm not telling you the narrative wrapper on top of it. I say wrapper very loosely here, but like the actual story, I'm just giving you the progression. So someone can go out and take that idea, please, I will play your game. But I would absolutely love to see that because I want to play your game, but also because that narrative that I have on top of it makes it make sense, right? The player experience I want to get at, despite me going, hey, there's a system where you can only invest so much, right, in progression in certain characters. And by doing the right thing for every character, you will actually lock yourself out of other characters. So you can't just, right, give the characters cookies and then they all like you, right? And
Yeah.
that's like the consequence design of that approach. God, I might just go make this game now. Sorry.
No, but this is precisely what I was talking about. Is
Yeah.
like
Because now
getting in
I'm in
this
that headspace. I'm
mindset.
like, actually, I'm just gonna go make this game. I'm
Yeah,
like,
it's
sorry
really
guys,
invigorating.
podcast
Yeah.
over.
Yeah. Podcast over. We're done. We got to go make a game.
Yeah. No, that's hilarious. So I know I'm like so excited because I was like, oh my God, actually, Nicholas would want to make this game with me.
Yeah, no, definitely 100%. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because like, and this is, I mean, we love you guys so much. This is what we want for you. We want you to not be in the position that Lauren and I in our day jobs are often in. We're like, oh man, I got to get this thing done. It's so annoying. I can't believe I have to do this. Like, we want to be in that place where we're like, I really want to work on this. I don't know what I'm doing, but that's great. I'm going to figure it out. And that's what we want for you all. We want you to feel. I think maybe we don't talk about this enough because, especially when we're talking about player experience and like UX design and things like that, it's very much like, oh, well, what does the player want? Like, but oftentimes we need to think about what we as designers want. Like, how do we want to feel? Like, we think about how the player is supposed to feel, how, like, what situations we put them in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also, how do we want to feel when we're making something?
Yeah. And I think,
yeah.
yeah. And this is the great lie of becoming a director in AAA is that your proudest moments will be when you realize finally, like, this is how I wanted to feel playing this game. I am the player. Right. And
Yeah.
so I say it's a lie because so much of the politics and hierarchy in established AAA companies is that the director is someone who just has to have an opinion on everything, sits in meetings all day, and then never plays the game. But at the end of the day, the game directors of these companies are the players. Their job is to play the game and become that player advocate for the whole experience. Right.
Yeah.
And so even if you aren't, say, like any game director, I'm going to say UX, art, narrative, like I'm just animation. I'm just going to lump everybody in there, right? Like if you aren't playing the thing that you're making, it's like you're not reading the words that you're writing on the book. You're not watching the scenes of the movie that you've written, right? Like a director is there almost obsessively looking at the product, looking at the screen, look at what's being created, and then just kind of offering the tweaks and the guidance to be like, here's the actual things that I want to see. And I think that's what's really, really, I know I called it the great lie, but it's not so much of a lie, is that you unfortunately don't spend your whole time doing that. And so coming back to actually creating the game, that's how we want you to feel, is remember that when you are in that headspace, you are not only like the player advocate, what's the player experience you want other people to have? You got to remember that, like, what is the experience you want yourself to have playing the game? Because if you're not having fun, like, I don't think anyone's going to be having fun with your game. Assuming that you're working on a specific novel, new mechanic, you like it kind of experience, versus if I was, say, working on a super Twitch shooter, Call of Duty, like I might not be having fun because I'm really bad at Twitch games, right? So just so we're clear, right? If you don't have a job in the industry and you're like, but I'm not having fun playing the game, like, no, just get your paycheck, be happy. Okay, you have a job in the industry, be happy.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
I think I want to end on the note of, like, we don't want you to quit your job. We just want you to try and rediscover.
Yeah, rediscover the joy.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that, I mean, I think Lauren said it much better than I could. And so I want to remind you all that this has been Furidashi. We love you all so much. We also have a blog, gamedesigndiscourse.substack.com, where every month I post whatever random crap comes into my head. Oftentimes it's organized, sometimes it's not. Apologies if it's not, but you're also not paying for it, so I don't really feel bad about it. You can follow us on Twitter. Well, you can follow Lauren on Twitter at the Lauren Ash. if you want to follow me at Academicality, you can send a request. My account is locked because I just don't really use Twitter for that anymore. We're also at Furidashi Pod on Twitter as well. So if you want to follow us there, that is a great thing to do. But I definitely recommend the Substack. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for listening, and stay healthy, stay safe, and rediscover your passion for games.